There we go.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Keith Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Water Polo West, and along with me is Christina Kavosis, our Provincial Head Coach. Thanks for making time for the Athlete Parent Meeting tonight. This is to discuss the Provincial Training Centre and our Team BC program for 2022-2023. I've got a short PowerPoint presentation to take you through, and at the end we'll provide everybody with an opportunity to ask questions. But there's the chat function. Please feel free to put your questions in there. Happy to take any questions that you might have. With that said, I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully, and Christina, if you could tell me what you end up seeing, make sure we see the right thing.
Sounds good.
I'm going to stop.
Yeah, you can see the PowerPoint there and then slides on the side in case you want it full screen.
I did want it full screen. Just give me a second there, everybody.
Good. Still have a few in the waiting room.
Same thing.
Same thing. Slides on the side, not full view. Not sure why.
Okay. I don't know. Is it visible to you, Christina?
Yeah, you can see like the main slide, but you just have your slides on the side there in case that matters. But if not, we're good to go. You could still see one. It's all good that we still have quite a few people joining. So it's.
I think that you should start the slideshow and then share the slideshow. You got it.
How about? I think that was correct. Does that look good?
That looks good.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for whoever provided that technical tip.
Thank you.
Okay, as I said, my name is Keith Ryan. I'm the Executive Director, and this is Christina Kavosis. She's the Provincial Head Coach. Thanks for making time for water polo tonight. So just a quick introduction about our vision of Water Polo West. The main focus of our organization is to provide a water polo experience for as many as possible athletes, for as long as possible, in the best possible environment. And that generally are three statements that govern everything we do, including how we approach things at the Provincial Training Centre. The Provincial Training Centre is a Water Polo West initiative. It's to provide a world-class training environment. Our primary pool is a UBC Aquatic Centre, but we will be using other pools periodically as they become available and regionally as they become necessary. So, for example, in Kelowna. One of the aspects of a provincial training centre in any sport in British Columbia is there can often be a national training centre tie-in, and this has been something that's existed within some provinces for several years. Water Polo West was formed in 2018, December 2018, and is now waiting on Water Polo Canada to make decisions about how they're going to handle national training centres in Canada. Most recently, last year, they devolved the senior program back to the provinces. And so we're now waiting on word from Water Polo Canada's new high performance director to confirm what the regional development centre or national training centre model is going to be for Canada. Just as a heads up, the Water Polo Canada appointed a new high performance director towards the November, December of last year. We're still waiting to hear though. Our vision for athletes that we work with is to help all athletes reach their fullest potential. Is to provide them with best practices training environment and to do no harm. Safe sport has become a very important key part of delivery of sport in Canada and British Columbia. And so we'll endeavor always to do no harm to athletes. This includes avoiding overtraining, which results in injuries. It incorporates providing a contemporary training environment. What I mean by contemporary is a modern day approach to sport delivery. And we are most certainly providing an athlete-centered environment. I've often explained to people that no part of water polo exists without the athletes. You know, we don't develop referees for referees' sakes. We don't develop coaches for coaches' sake. We don't have competition for competition's sake. We don't have clubs for club's sake. We exist for the athletes. That's the only reason sport exists for the enjoyment and fulfillment of athletes. And with that said, we're really going to get into the components of the Provincial Training Centre, National Training Centre. And at this point, I'll hand over to Christina.
Welcome, everybody. It's great to see so many of you joining the Zoom tonight. If I pause, it's just because I'm continuing to admit a few people that are still joining, but we're excited to share a variety of the components that make up the PTC-NTC model. And ultimately, we look at the PTC to be an opportunity to develop our athletes primarily, and as Keith mentioned, coaches and officials as well through a provincial training center. And so as an extension of our provincial training center is the Team BC, or the provincial team program. And so we're looking for opportunities to evaluate our athletes across our age categories, and mandatory attendance comes into play with respect to being present at an evaluation, and provincial head coaches are also looking to find opportunities to scout and to observe athletes at local events. We've recently published the Team BC selection policy on our website, and we are developing the key athlete metrics that we'll be tracking and monitoring once we establish some of those training groups or cohorts. The whole idea behind this is to be able to share this information with athletes and with Water Polo Canada. For those of you that were with us last season, for example, we were able to host a national team camp where we were visited by senior national team coaches on both the men and women's side. So that was a big plus in returning from COVID and being able to get more athletes in the pool, and especially having that type of high performance camp. And the Provincial Training Center and Team BC programs are also acting as evaluation environments for our athlete carding, which was recently approved by Canadian Sport Institute Pacific. So we've also published that information in more detail on our website, and happy to provide links in the chat for anybody who would like to take a look at this afterwards as well. As we move down the list here, again, I could kind of talk in circles about all the various areas that we hope to support athletes. Another big one is identification at the collegiate level. And so working with athletes to create profiles for recruiting, providing them information on recruitment, for example, through partnerships with companies like Game Changer Sports. And finally, kind of all encompassing is that periodic training and development sessions. And as Keith mentioned, we're primarily at UBC, but working to access other facilities across the region as well, finding ways to offer pool sessions, but also dryland, multi-sport training opportunities, nutrition, mental health, injury prevention, anything that can complement a club training environment and support athlete health, well-being, and performance. Keith, anything you'd like to add on some of these bullets here? Or
no, I'd just like to just to provide a complete summary of that. So essentially what we have is a provincial training center initiated by Water Polo West. Primary activity of the PTC is to identify and evaluate athletes for selection to Team BC, Team BC project, and Team BC will projects, which we identify next, will bring the best athletes or a group of the best athletes together every year to go to various competitions. That's a summary.
Cool. All right, next slide for me, please.
Slide.
Awesome. So then, as Keith mentioned, looking to our Team BC program as an extension and sort of build off of the Provincial Training Center. We're in fall 22, so this is currently our evaluation stage, and this is for us to understand the athletes that we have across our age categories. So for those of you that may have checked it out online already, we're looking at a development pathway, which includes our 13U and 15U groups, and a more of a performance pathway as our athletes age along the pathway, which is 17U, 19U, and can also include some post-secondary athletes. So in the current moment, we have registrations open for evaluations at UBC, and also looking for opportunities to scout at local events where we can see athletes in a competitive environment playing with their own teams, their home clubs, which we think is incredibly important. Moment, just admitting more in the chat. All of our evaluation criteria has been developed in alignment with sports science and best practices, both from within water polo and outside of it. So we've really brought together research and as much as we possibly can from the water polo community to figure out what's incredibly important for our athlete evaluations. So speaking of tentative projects that we're looking at and exploring to support our team athletes, we are currently in talks with programs in Australia to see what opportunities may be present for competing against state teams. I'll pause quickly. Keith, anything you'd like to add on the Australia spring break trip?
Yeah, so what what we've been doing is researching where the best alignment comes for a Team BC provincial program. And research tells us that some of the crossover to the US system isn't always a fit. And more specifically, there's a lot of almost entirely a schools-based system. Whereas in many other sports, rugby would be a good example, soccer is another example, there are state teams, so that are equivalent to a provincial. So there's an Oregon State Soccer Association. They would run provincial teams, same Washington State, and similar things in other team sports. So we don't have that in water polo in the US. Football's the same. They are very schools-based based programs. So a provincial team doesn't have an automatically aligned competition in the US. It's very much schools-based. So we looked around the world, and one of the areas we identified that there is a very strong alignment between our level of play and the type of structure we have is Water Polo Australia. And so we've approached all of the major states in Australia, and they've all responded with very much a keen interest to have a discussion about how our programs align and what opportunities would exist to play them in Australia, and possibly back in Vancouver or in the Lower Mainland, and as well meeting in a third location. Some of the state teams from Australia train. A couple of years ago, they came up and trained in California. So there's all sorts of opportunities. So we see a good alignment there. Australia has a really good sports system. And so there's a lot of opportunities to sort of connect with a comparable program. So that's why Australia is on our list.
Totally. Thanks, Keith. And then moving forward later in the year, in the summertime, we're looking at national championships, which will be hosted by Water Polo Canada in Montreal. And finally, the Hawaiian Invitational Tournament, which is scheduled for July 31st and August 6th. So the variety of projects listed here are really to offer competitive opportunities for all of our PTC athletes to really maximize the number of participants who actually get a Team BC experience and an opportunity to develop and elevate their game. So that's where these options are coming into play at the moment. And of course, a lot of it will depend on the age groups and where we have interest across our athletes, but it's a bit of a summary there on what we're currently exploring and looking at. Keith, anything to add on the other events there?
No, I think just to generally talk about this past year with the national championships, Water Polo West was at the forefront of advancing the concept of a provincial national championship several years ago with Water Polo Canada. Unfortunately, Water Polo Canada really didn't decide to do things till very late in the year this year, and then they were even later with coming out the details. So we saw some athletes combined with other provinces. So there was a Team Quebec with some BEC athletes on, and I think a Team Alberta too. So I think the challenge now for us, and I'm just going to stop sharing the screen and talk a little bit about this. While Water Polo West is the organizer of Team BC, the program belongs to the athletes and the parents. If there is support and enthusiasm for a Team BC program in 2022-23, we'll have a prepared team ready to go to a national championships next July. If enthusiasm is low, there still might be a team going, but we'll have to wait and see how that would progress. So the Team BC program is really going to be a reflection of the enthusiasm or potentially lack thereof from the community. So we can provide the opportunity, and we can try and make them the best opportunities available to us. And what you have between the Hawaii tournament is an international opportunity to play higher levels of teams in a more relaxed environment, but nevertheless a very competitive environment in Hawaii. You have a national championship, which has got a lot of provinces excited about the concept of bringing a group of very high performing athletes from across the club system in any province to compete against the rest in Canada. And that level of competition hasn't been seen for quite a number of years in water polo. And then aligning from a performance pathways space with the Australia trip with comparable programs that will challenge our athletes and our coaches to compete at a higher level and really advance the player development aspect of what we do. And these are these generally speaking are the role of a provincial body in any sport in BC. This is a standard structure within every sport. Where water polo comes in is that there was a bit of a very dysfunctional previous PSO called BC Water Polo that ultimately failed, which is why Water Polo West exists. So now what we have is the start of a new programming. So clean slate, starting with new programming. We're very fortunate to have the facility at UBC, but as we mentioned, we're open to diversifying that programming into other pools, but pool space is very limited. We're looking at creative ways to have provincial programming in other communities. Just to wrap that up and say that we do have an overall goal of the PTC to service more than just the Team BC program. It does have a bigger remit than that. It's just that the Team BC program is a very critical part of it and is ultimately the apex of our payer pathway in the youth ranks. There we go. So that concludes the sort of formal presentation. Christina, are there any questions in the chat area that we need to sort of address?
One question is an estimate as to what the cost will be for Australia and Hawaii. And that's something that we're certainly going to look at kind of building out and giving more information on. But Keith, anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, we should have, as we look forward, some of the information isn't available for us yet. So for example, the Hawaii tournament, they haven't even published the entry fees yet. We kind of know what they charged a few years ago. So we're waiting. They have promised that information relatively soon, but we're at the mercy there. Flights will also be the other major cost factor for us there. So I think we'll start hopefully having some numbers in the next 4 weeks on key areas. The next step for us with the Australia trip is to have some online Zoom calls with each of the states and to work out which states we will go to, just to give you the list. So we have spoken to Western Australia, Southern Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland. So if we were purely on the East Coast, that would be a certain cost, but if we were going across to the West Coast, then that might be a different factor. So there's a few things factors that will come in that will change that price. So we will, however, hope to have that within 4 weeks.
Perfect. And then another question on cost, it's just in general, the cost for the provincial development program. And so at the moment, for any athlete registering for the PTC evaluation sessions, it's $150. Similar to what Keith just mentioned about travel and trying to find pool time and access to different facilities. We'll have some more information on what it might look like for training groups once we can see where registration is at, what those groups look like, and what pool time may be accessible to us. So once we have that, we'll be sharing more details. Anything else you have on that one, Keith, for overall development?
Very much. As years go by and as Water Polo West secures more of a solid financial future, and I'll give one of the things that's happening in the next 4 months is that the entire funding mechanism for provincial organizations is being reviewed. We're also in the process of securing stability with our gaming grant and increasing that. So there'll be some finances coming into the organization that will be dedicated towards the performance pathway program. All of the clubs, I think pretty much all of the clubs receive a gaming grant, and they receive a gaming grant for club operations. And PSOs like Water Polo West can receive a gaming grant for our high performance pathway programming. So that's where we'll be accessing funds that can hopefully offset and support Team BC, the Provincial Training Center. The other key part, and so that's the gaming grant. And then on the core grant, each one of the provincial bodies receives a core grant, which ranges. Currently, Water Polo West receives $42,000. We would hope to be in the region of $70,000 to $100,000 to give you a benchmark. BC Artistic Swimming, which is about the same size as us, a bit smaller actually, their core grant is $110,000. There's also a separate funding for Olympic sports, which Water Polo is called High Performance Programming, but we're probably not looking at a review of that funding for a few years. All in all, saying that there are 3 forms of funding that can support what we're doing to help offset the costs of the provincial team. Any other questions, Christina?
I'm just typing a response to one here around how athletes will be contacted for their interests, and so may as well share it. But we've been sharing all information on Provincial Training Center and Team BC through all participants registered in the RAMP platform. We'll also share it with our clubs directly and through our social media channels. So quite a few different areas to try and make sure we cover as many people as possible, but primarily mass emails through the RAMP system seem to be the most effective at the moment. Following up for Kelowna athletes, we will have some different discussions for Kelowna when it comes to how often would you have to come to Vancouver. We're exploring some opportunities to also bring some regional opportunities to the interior. So Marcello, thank you for that question. We'll follow up on some more, and I see Kristen, who coaches for Kelowna, with a thumbs up there. So that's great. So that is going to come into play, and we'll have some more info. Tracy, your question, do we have the dates for the evaluations? Yes, they are all on the PTC calendar online. And so just be sure to kind of switch through each month, because it won't all show on the very first page. I'll put that link in the chat. And then I see a question for the developmental pathway, whether they accept 10-year-olds or not. You'll have to forgive me. I have to remember what age 2011 would be. I think that's the youngest birth year we had included on there, but that would be the question. So we can also have, I'm happy to have conversations with anybody who would like to chat more about their particular athletes and whether or not it's too early to join the pathway. Here we go. So are you looking at opportunities for Vancouver Island-based athletes as well? Yes, we are. And we are happy to have more conversations about that and what that might be. But yeah, it's a little trickier with the regional development in areas where we don't have centers set up yet, but working on it. Keith, anything you want to add in there as I'm kind of rapid firing and questions are coming in the chat?
Yeah, I'll go back one. There was just one bit, somebody looking for a bit more of an expansion, perhaps, on the why there isn't a regional development center in BC versus Quebec, Saskatchewan, Alberta. So where Water Polo West was sort of a later arrival to that discussion, the IDC program existed before us. We did sign a contract and send it into Water Polo Canada. They've not returned that. They then had, because it was Justin Oliveri and we were getting close to agreeing that. Since then, Justin left immediately after the Olympics, was that 18 months ago? And now we have a new high performance director. There is a bigger picture issue with us and Water Polo Canada. It's been talked about at the club level and across the provinces, and that is the competition focus of the national body. And so they haven't really, while the RDC's regional development centers in each province, stroke national centers, exist essentially in name only. One of the key components that the IDC is planned to be is that in order to be selected to an age group national team, you have to be training at the province's RDC. But as I said, none of the provinces have heard from the high performance director since he arrived about this issue. So we're all still in a bit of a holding pattern. The AGM is in 2 weeks, and I would expect to see something come out of that. That Water Polo Canada AGM is in 2 weeks. So hopefully we'll get a bit more sort of detail. Ultimately, if there is no movement from Water Polo Canada on the their side of the component, recognizing that they're not bringing any money to the table or bringing any financial support in any capacity, it's not problematic for us financially if they're not involved, but I think they are arguably now with the challenge that they've devolved the national training center for senior athletes back to each province. That as well as a piece of the puzzle that hasn't been worked out with every province about, well, what does that look like? What does that mean for age group national team players in their home province when they return to play in BC, if they're away at college or if they're a national team athlete that is not away on a professional team. So I would say the RDC situation is very unclear. We're hoping that Water Polo Canada will provide some more clarity around it in the next month, but we might have to wait. Any more, Christina?
Nothing else in the chat at the moment. One of them was just around acceptance or sort of selection pathways. And again, after getting a better idea of where our registration numbers are at, how many athletes we have interested, we'll hopefully be able to create a more detailed timeline when it comes to athlete selections. And another one coming up here. So for Team Canada, AG&T evaluations will continue to be problematic as we are not using Canadian Team Canada evaluations. Would you like to expand on that question? I'm not entirely sure if I'm understanding.
I'm not sure I entirely, but I agree with it. So where our entire selection policy has been built from multitude of sources, including Water Polo Canada, using their gold medal profile as part of it. I mean, essentially at the moment, it assumes that they are, we're not using Canadian team candidate evaluations. We have requested from Water Polo Canada on no less than, I would say, 6 occasions for a copy of their selection policies. And the answer is that it doesn't exist. There is no selection policy. There are a thing called the gold medal profile, which is a series of sort of ranges of, and Christina can add a bit more to this if I fumble it, is that they basically say, okay, well, these are the expectations of metrics of an individual athlete. What we've done is we've expanded that into more comprehensive evaluations. So I don't know that there's a disconnect between what we're doing and what they're doing. It's just that ours has gone into more detail, and we provided a more expansive policy about why we would select athletes to Team BC. Ultimately, it's still up to the national body to see athletes and select them based on their criteria. And that, yeah, that's that. And if the person wants to come off and open that, have that conversation on the online now, it's probably very relevant for some of the people on the call. If you wanted to follow up with any questions, please feel free to do so. It's not an area we're fearful of discussing. Will that evaluation be? Yes. So great question. One of the reasons we've done an expansive evaluation criteria is that the goal of that is that whether an athlete is selected to a Team BC project or not, the conversation should be able to occur as to why an athlete was or was not selected. There might not always be agreement between a parent, an athlete, and our selection, but we should be able to explain it in detail and give you metrics that says why. And I'll be very honest with you, I will challenge every single province in the water polo community, and for that matter, across sports, to show a selection policy that meets most of the rigors of our policy. We've used, for example, BC Rugby have an excellent selection policy, and we've used part of their model within ours. It's very important that we feel that while, again, when an athlete doesn't get selected to a Team BC project, there might be frustration, but we should be able to state exactly why an athlete's selected or not selected. So hopefully that answers your question. Just reading this question, the selection policy provides more details.
Yeah, that one's me replying, and the question is just above Keith there. If athletes are unable to make it to an evaluation session, will there be other opportunities? That's a big reason why we're hoping to also have coaches come out to local events, because we recognize there's another component to that, especially playing in a game environment with your home team. Again, if you are located in Kelowna or Vancouver Island, we're working on strategies to also reach those athletes. So perhaps that's relevant to that question as well. But the selection policy will provide more details on what to do if you cannot make any of the sessions for your age group.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to sort of talk about this. This has been an evolution of sport over about 20 years in BC. The language that you may have heard before, we still hear it now in some sports, including water polo, is you're attending a tryout. Well, we don't do tryouts. We do evaluations. Athletes have a very different pathway to higher levels of play. They are not monolithic. While some people might feel there was a single route through a sports system. What we will be doing is evaluating, providing support for the development of athletes, and seeing those athletes in as many different scenarios as we can do within our limited resources. So as Christina says, good as an example, the UBC tournament's coming up. Christina will be in attendance for at least one of those days. I think there's a Fraser Valley competition on the calendar. We're hoping to attend that and to see the athletes in situ. Then we have the NCL events. We have other activities that we're going to be doing at the PTC, where we will see the athletes in both their home training environment and then how they perform in a provincial training center. Then also we get a chance to see them as we form a Team BC and they go away onto projects, whether that's Australia or Hawaii or Montreal for the national championships, and continuing to evaluate over a period of time athletes peak and valley throughout the life cycle of their playing career. And so it's also not a one and done situation. We work with the athletes as long as we can until they've graduated and gone through into the adult system. And so our job there is to sort of support that. So we are providing a I would say, a more contemporary evaluation process, not the tryout model.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I just added key links in the chat. One of the questions was, will assessments be available prior to being assessed? And so there are areas that are key for evaluation that we've included on the Team BC website. And then you can further check the tab on the Team BC selection policy for more information on if you're an eligible athlete, what it means if you can attend a session. And finally, in the athlete carding session, we also have a document linked there where you can check out a matrix in the appendix. So again, it's kind of an ongoing evaluation process, and we recognize that athletes bring different strengths and areas for growth to the game. And so we want to provide the best gap analysis that we can to meet each athlete where they're at and best support them towards their goals. So we're trying to move it away from just being a tick box or quantitative data that might only serve one aspect of the game, but to get a really well-rounded understanding of what a player brings. And a lot of those things are attitude and resilience and motivation and how they interact in the team environment. And so those things are all incredibly important. And I think as provincial coaches, we will also have conversations with our athlete group at each session to say, hey, this is what we're looking for. This is what's really critical to our Team BC program and this training environment. And so we require that all athletes meet those standards, which are really important, just as important as the work that they're doing in the pools as well.
I think one of the observations I have over athlete selection over multiple different sports is that sometimes we're just afraid to admit it's quite complex and fearful of actually putting things down on paper. Yeah. It's never going to be a perfect science because if it was, every sport would have a very clear selection policy, but they don't. And I encourage you, please go on to other sports. And if you can find a really good selection policy other than the ones we've looked at, feel free to point them our way. I think you'll struggle to find them. What we're trying to do is provide clarity in that selection policy to the very best effort we can, so that there can be a discussion point with the athlete about what's expected, what standards to be achieved. And it's also a document that changes over time. We really haven't had an opportunity to benchmark athletes in so many different categories of performance. The next year, 2 years will provide us with more data that will allow us to refine the selection policy. So we'll continue to evolve that document and develop the very best policy that allows us to evaluate athletes to the fullest, in the best possible way.
Yeah, I think you took the words right out of my mouth in saying that it's a complex piece when it comes to athlete selection policy. And for our athletes on the call, I think there's an understanding and a recognition of the complexity of our sport and what goes into it. And it's not as simple as making or breaking qualifying times, for example. And so there is a lot that we can look at to support and to evaluate athletes and to help them sort of advance their game in the areas that they hope to. So that's really how we're looking at it. But as Keith mentioned, we're dedicated to fixing things if they're not working, to improving them if we feel like it's not meeting the mark. And we want it to be the best possible process for athletes. And it ties into why we're looking at so many options for Team BC projects, is finding ways to say, okay, if we've got a rostered group that's going to national championships in Montreal, can we still provide an opportunity for athletes that may not attend that trip or an Australia trip and still provide a competitive, high quality experience to be part of a Team BC program? And so we're looking at ways to engage along that pathway, whether it's our development group, starting out, performance pathway, and complementing what all of our participants are doing in their home clubs.
So just sort of wrapping and sort of creating some sort of clarity around it, just to confirm what a few things are. The Provincial Training Center is the training center operated by Water Polo West at UBC. Fulfills a few different functions for Water Polo West. As Christina mentioned, we're going to be doing referee development, coach development. One of its primary roles is the evaluation tool for selection of athletes to Team BC. The phrase RDC is the Regional Development Center that has previously been offered by Water Polo Canada. Water Polo West has asked to rename it the Provincial National Training Center. We're waiting to hear back about whether that would happen, but that would essentially be a partnership between ourselves and the national body and pathway, and provide a direct evaluation tool methodology for athletes transitioning from to age group national teams. The Team BC program is the representative team of British Columbia in different age groups, and we will form teams to do different projects every year. One of the key projects in any provincial national calendar has arrived on in the Water Polo Canada, and that will be the National Provincial Championships, which will be in Montreal in early July next year.
Mhm.
Great. Was there one more question I see pop up or not?
Yes, and it was sort of in line as you were talking about age group national teams or senior national team programs. Question being, will assessments be available or forwarded to AG&T evaluators? And in general, we're working on ways so that when we collect our data and complete any evaluations, we make them accessible for Water Polo Canada and their coaches. So we did a little bit of this last year when we had the women's camp, for example, and then we went back to collect some data requested by the head women's coach. And so we're using technology to the best of our ability to provide that amount of information so that they can check on athletes in our PTC and in our province.
Just before we answer that question about the CSI that's coming out, I want to talk about CSI kiting. Just for anybody, and just provide clarity around CSI kiting. So CSI is the Canadian Sports Institute, and we work with, and that's across Canada or different entities. It's not a non-governmental organization. It operates in some provinces more than others. In BC, it's quite active, and Ontario it is too. And it controls a carding program in BC. So national team athletes are often carded. It means they get funding from the federal government, and it has more gravitas at that level because it does provide funding. Some provinces like Quebec also provide funding for carded athletes. In BC, it is a very minimal benefit, but it is a specific benefit. For example, access to gyms and swimming pools is included within a large group of different public facilities. So more specifically, if you get carded at the provincial level, there are the main benefit is access to facilities, and if you like, the gravitas of being a carded athlete in the BC system, it carries some weight for potentially people looking at whether you get selected to age group national teams or potentially looked at from colleges and university. But it really is a carding process that provides some benefit to you as a provincial athlete. Christina, does that sound overly complicated? Did I make that more complicated than it needed to be?
No, I think that's kind of the gist of it, right? So there's not, I think the question is probably looking towards whether or not there is like a financial funding opportunity directly from that carding process. And the way that I understand it to be is there is not that through the CSI carding process. It's rather those specific benefits like access to facilities. I just put a link in the chat as well to look them over because I can't remember them off the top of my head. Yeah, and they do have a link for some grants and bursaries that may be available as well, but probably involve some other steps.
And then the only other sort of component which really doesn't exist for water polo in the short term, midterm, I don't think, is the Canada Games, Western Canada Games, BC Games cycle. So you'll often see references within other sports to going to the BC Summer Games, going to the BC Winter Games, same thing for Western Canada and Canada Games. Water polo isn't a part of those, hasn't been for quite a few years, I would imagine. It certainly predates me if it was. So there is a Canada Games program, and I think Water Polo West has considered trying to get back into that as a Commonwealth and as an Olympic sport. There's also talk about them entering in the Commonwealth Games. So that's also usually a Team BC opportunity that isn't currently on the Water Polo calendar, but you know, at some point it could be, but I wouldn't have thought it will happen in the current athlete crop's lifetime. All right. Well, that's going to conclude everything. Thanks, everybody. And I appreciate, I know Fraser Valley's on, they're all in the room. Hello, Fraser Valley. Thanks for everybody for coming on. Thanks to Fraser Valley for facilitating any of the clubs that facilitated you all being on board tonight. We will continue to communicate more information. This is the earliest we've ever been able to communicate about the program, especially as the last 2 years have been under COVID. We thank you for your involvement within water polo. Oh, we got a question come up.
Yes, about assessments for the competitive teams and also for the development team. Evaluations are across the board for all of our athletes. So the teams that we select will depend on the competitions that we pursue. So that's still a little bit TBD, but we're still looking at ways to evaluate, assess, and provide feedback to all of our athletes that enter the pathway. So the development pathway so far, I mean, in previous years as well, has seen some of our smaller numbers. So we're interested to see how many of our younger athletes do sign up. But certainly there is still an assessment component, but the CSI high performance carding, for example, usually comes into the conversation at the train to compete or the performance level of the pathway. Hopefully that answers that one there. And finally, I see we still have quite a few people on the call, so I'll send out a follow-up as well, but we are looking for registration. Oh, yes, there will be, Claire, a recording of this meeting, so no problem. We'll make sure everyone has that information. And we're looking for a registration deadline of this Thursday night for our 17U, 19U athletes for those evaluations, so that we can accommodate and understand how many athletes to expect for those. But I will follow up with that for everybody who attended the meeting tonight. Send a follow-up to and through our channels to make sure everyone gets it. And please feel free to reach out with more questions if you have them.
Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate your time tonight, and